The prison legions are one of the most underrepresented parts of the Imperial Guard on the tabletop for Warhammer 40,000. There should be hundreds of these legions across most battlefields. So today I'm going to show you a really quick and easy way to paint great looking prison soldiers for the Imperial Guard. So the first thing I've done is I've primed this model black, as this will give us a nice smooth, even base coat for the rest of our colours to work from. With some Thunderhawk blue first, which I'm going to use to paint all over the uniform to this Imperial Guardsman. I'm using Thunderhawk blue here, so we're going to get that kind of blue prison uniform. So it's not going to look as stark as the sort of orange jumpsuit style that some people like. I'm going for that more sort of British prison uniform look, this sort of bluey grey colour. So I'm just making sure I coat all of the uniform of this Imperial Guardsman with a couple of layers of Thunderhawk blue. As this is quite a thin paint, it's going to take a couple of layers to build up to solid coverage, but by keeping the layers nice and thin and slowly building up over a few layers, I'll get a nice solid coat of Thunderhawk blue all over the Imperial Guardsman. Make sure I catch all of that uniform with a couple of layers of Thunderhawk blue. And after a couple of layers of Thunderhawk blue, you see I've got a nice solid coat all over that uniform. So the next step is I'm going to paint the armour. So for this I'm coming in with Mechanica Standard Grey. I'm going to apply this all over the armour panels to this Guardsman. So it's the armour on his chest and back, as well as the shoulder pads and the helmet. Just carefully applying a couple of layers of Mechanica Standard Grey so I get a nice smooth even coat all over the armour. So this Mechanica Standard Grey is going to work really well with that Thunderhawk blue to give us that sort of grey, light blue prison uniform that we see in a lot of UK prisons, but it's also going to double up and give a great looking sort of military uniform effect at the same time. And after I applied that Mechanica Standard Grey, it's got a nice smooth, even coverage, and that uniform look starting to come together. Now with some Bugman's Glow, I'm going to paint the skin. Obviously I'm being really careful around the grey of the helmet I've already painted. Just make sure I catch all of the skin with a couple of layers of Bugman's Glow. So as I said in the introduction, I feel that the prison legions are a little bit underrepresented on the tabletop. These will be a great source of soldiers for the Imperial Guard. Just go to a prison planet, demand a bunch of soldiers, and send them out to fight for the Imperium. I feel there really should be more of these on the tabletop, and that's why I'm painting this one up today. And after a couple of layers of Bugman's Glow, that's all of the skin painted. Next thing I'm going to pick out is the boots and the belt. For this I'm using Corvus Black. I'm just going to apply a layer of Corvus Black all over the boots. Corvus Black's great for this because it's not quite as dark as Abaddon Black, so we can still apply a shade and highlight. I'm also picking out the belt at this stage as well. Just being careful around that Thunderhawk blue uniform. And I'm also going to paint the buckle black as well, just because in a military setting you don't want anything that shines, so a lot of soldiers darken down their belt buckles so they don't cause a glare. And with the boots and belt picked out, the model's really coming together now. So the next thing I'm going to paint is the gun. For this I'm using Caliban Green. I'm going to just apply this all over the casing to his las rifle. I often give my Imperial Guardsmen green las guns, no matter what regiment they're from. I just sort of assume that'd be the default colour, but obviously you can paint the body to the las gun whatever colour you want, or whatever ties in with any other Imperial Guard soldiers you've already painted. For me, I'm just picking out that las gun with a couple of layers of Caliban Green. With the las gun picked out, Next, I'm going to pick out all of the sort of Aquila markings. For this, I'm using Celestra Grey. I'm just going to carefully pick out all of these details on the helmet and the lasgun. Obviously, you want to be quite careful. Make sure you don't apply the Celestra Grey over any of the areas we've already painted. Just pick out these markings with a bit of Celestra Grey. I often use Celestra Grey for areas that I want to end up being white. It's a really great base coat of being that just off-white colour, so it gives good coverage, but also allows me to shade it to add some definition and also apply some highlights as well, rather than if I painted these areas with pure white. And with those markings picked out, the only thing left to base coat on this miniature are the metallic details. So for that, I'm using Lead Belcher. And I'm just going to carefully apply a couple of layers of Lead Belcher to all the areas I want to be metal. So it's going to be the muzzle to the lasgun, the magazine, areas like that, a couple of buttons, the pistol grip, and any of the other metallic details, like this bar I'm going to pick out running along the top. Just want to pick out any of the metallic details with a layer of Lead Belcher. And with the Lead Belcher applied, that is all of the base coat applied to this Imperial Guardsman. So now it's time to start shading. First shade I'm going to apply is Reichland Flesh Shade, which I'm going to apply to all of the areas of skin, his face and his hands. Just want to catch these with a shade of Reichland Flesh Shade. It's going to sink into those recesses, create some definition on the skin. And with some known oil, I want to shade everything else. So I want to catch all of the armour, the Aquilas, the body to the lasgun, all of the uniform. Just want to cover all the rest of the model with a shade of known oil. Now, often when I'm painting Imperial Guardsmen, I pin shade the armour. But as this is for Prison Legion, I'm going to just shade all over it, because I assume that they would have slightly dirtier, sort of second-hand armour, rather than the really nice, pristine stuff for the more regular Imperial Guardsmen. So I'm just shading the rest of the model with some known oil. If you're enjoying the video, please press like. If you want more videos, press the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And if you'd like to support the channel, please become a member by pressing the join button down below or joining me over on Patreon. After those shades have dried, you can see they've really darkened down that model and added definition into all of the recesses. So now with some Bugman's Glow, I'm going to start highlighting the skin. So for this, I'm applying it to areas that the shade didn't settle. So whatever there's Reichland Flesh Shade in a recess, I'm leaving that shaded area, but brightening up all the smoother, raised and flatter surfaces with a little bit of Bugman's Glow. You can see here on the fingers, the shade settled in between all of the fingers, so I'm just picking out the raised parts back up to their bright colour with a bit of Bugman's Glow, but making sure I leave all of that Reichland Flesh Shade showing in all the recesses. And after that Bugman's Glow's been applied, you can see how it's brightened up those areas just a little bit. So now I'm coming in with some Cadian Flesh Tone. I'm going to carefully apply this in the middle of the areas I just applied the Bugman's Glow. So areas like the nose, the bottom lip, the cheeks, things like that. I'm just applying small bits, Cadian Flesh Tone, in the middle of the areas I just applied the Bugman's Glow. And on the fingers, I'm going to focus this towards sort of the most sharp points, so knuckles, fingertips, areas like that. Just applying a small bit of Cadian Flesh Tone as a highlight to these areas. I applied it to the knuckles on one hand, doing the fingertips on the next. Let's just add some interest and brighten up that skin a little bit more. With the Cadian Flesh Tone applied, there's just one final highlight left to apply to the skin. And that's with some Kislev flesh. Just going to apply some small spots to the most raised parts of the model. So the very tip of the nose, the bottom lip, the sharpest points of the cheeks. I'm just applying small amounts of Kislev flesh. I'm also going to carefully apply this at the very tips of the knuckles, applying a small spot, making sure that Cadian flesh tone still showing through. I'm also just carefully picking out the very tips of the fingers as well. And with the Kislev flesh applied, that is the skin highlighted. So the next step is I'm going to paint the eyes on the model. For this, I'm using Abaddon Black first. I'm just going to carefully apply this into the recesses for the eye sockets. We're doing some quite small areas here, so I'm just being really careful as I apply this Abaddon Black into those recesses. And with some white scar, I'm going to very carefully apply a thin line within the Abaddon Black just applied. I'm being very careful here, just applying a small spot of white scar within the Abaddon Black. And finally, with some Abaddon Black again, I'm just going to paint a small vertical line in the middle of the white. This will act like a pupil. If you make any mistakes at this stage, you can come back in with black and white again to keep cutting back until you get a result you're happy with, but a small vertical line in the middle of the white should give some great looking eyes. And with the eyes painted, let's add some personality to the model. So the next thing I'm going to highlight is that uniform. For this, I'm starting off with Thunderhawk Blue again. And I'm going to apply this to all of the areas that the shade didn't settle on the uniform. So wherever there's known oil in a recess, I'm leaving that known oil, but brightening up all of the rays and flat surfaces back to their original brighter colour with some Thunderhawk Blue. This works really well with the shade to really add definition to the uniform, and by working in nice thin layers with the Thunderhawk Blue, I'm going to get nice transitions through the darkest colours through to my brightest highlights. This will give us a really nice looking uniform when it's finished. You can see how I'm just looking to see where that known oil settled, and then I'm leaving the settled known oil where it is, but bringing all of the other areas back up to their brighter colour with some Thunderhawk Blue. Also doing the same on the arms as well, making sure I do this over the whole uniform, just leaving that known oil in the recesses, but brightening up all of the raised and flat surfaces back to their brighter colour with some Thunderhawk Blue. Now with a 50-50 mix of Thunderhawk Blue and Rust Grey, I'm going to apply this into the middle of all the areas that I just applied that Thunderhawk Blue. So I'm making sure that I leave the Thunderhawk Blue showing around the edges, and I focus this towards the most upwards facing surfaces, highest points, and areas that would catch the light the most. I'm just coming back through around the model, applying some of this 50-50 mix in the middle of all the areas I just applied the pure Thunderhawk Blue. By keeping this nice and thin, it allows little bits of the other layers to show through, and this is what gives those really nice transitions on the uniform. Will give us a great looking model at the end. So let's make sure you take your time at this stage. The uniform is so much of the model, it is worth spending that extra little bit of time to make sure you get this in all the areas you want, so you get a really great looking fabric effect on your Imperial Guardsman. Doing the same on the arms as well, focusing to those raised areas, highest points and upward facing surfaces, applying a little bit of this mix in the middle of the areas that I just applied the previous step. And with that 50-50 mix applied, you can see how it's really brightened up those areas of fabric. So there's just one final highlight left to apply, and that's with some pure Rust Grey. You're just going to apply this as an edge highlight to all the sharpest points. So around the edge of his jacket here, just applying a thin edge highlight of Rust Grey. as well as any other sharp points on the uniform. So tops of creases, folds, sharp angles, anything like that. Just catching the very tops of these areas with a really thin edge highlight of rust grey. This just really brightens up those edges of the uniform and really sells the effect and gives a great looking fabric at the end. So I'm just carefully working my way around the model, applying this edge highlight of rust grey to all the sharpest creases and folds on the uniform. So much like with the previous step, it's really worth just taking that little bit of time on this stage to make sure you catch all of these raised details and sharp points, as it really helps sell that effect of the uniform catching the light at the tops of its creases. And on the arms, I'm doing much the same, just catching the very edges of his cuffs and the tops of all those folds with a thin edge highlight of rust grey. Edge highlight applied, you can see how it's really giving us a great looking uniform. So now it's time to highlight his boots. For this I'm using Mechanica Standard Grey, and I'm just going to carefully apply a small edge highlight to the sharpest points of any raised details on his boots. So I want to keep these lines nice and thin and just apply an edge highlight of Mechanica Standard Grey to all of the raised details on the boots. And I'm also doing the same to the belt as well. I'm just catching the edges of the belt with a really thin edge highlight of Mechanica Standard Grey. It just adds a little bit of interest to the belt and the model. So I'm just carefully applying that edge highlight of Mechanica Standard Grey. And with the Mechanica Standard Grey applied, you can see how we've highlighted up those black areas. The next thing I'm going to highlight is his armour. For this, I'm coming in with Dawnstone first, and I'm going to apply this as an edge highlight to all the areas of the armour. So I'm carefully applying an edge highlight of Dawnstone to all the sharp edges and sharp angles to the armour. All of the raised details, and just carefully picking these out with an edge highlight of Dawnstone. This is going to give the impression of a sharp edge to that armour, like the edge is catching the light and reflecting it back. So once again, just take your time at this stage as you work your way around the armour, slowly applying this edge highlight of Dawnstone to all the armour panels. Making sure I catch the shoulder pads here. And I'm also going to apply this highlight to the helmet, just carefully picking out all of the raised details with an edge highlight of Dawnstone. You want to make sure you keep this line nice and thin and nice and even as you work your way around the model. And with that edge highlight of Dawnstone applied, you can see how it's caught all the edges and brightened up that armour. But now with some Administratum Grey, I'm going to apply another highlight within the one we just applied. So you want to keep this one even thinner than the previous highlight. Just apply a really thin edge highlight of Administratum Grey within the Dawnstone highlight we just applied. So we'll really give the impression of a nice sharpness to the armour. That light's really catching on those sharp edges. Parts here like the shoulder pads to the side of the brush. This gives you a nice smooth straight line really easily. But I'm just making sure I apply an even thinner edge highlight of Administratum Grey within the Dawnstone edge highlight I just applied. And with that highlight applied, you can see how the model's really coming together now. It's just a few more details left to highlight. The next of those is going to be the casing to his rifle. For this, I'm using Warpstone Glow. And I'm just going to carefully apply an edge highlight to the casing of his las rifle. So for this, I'm just picking out all of the sharpest details, all of the buttons, switches, things like that, as well as carefully applying an edge highlight going all the way around the outside to the casing to the rifle. I'm going to keep this nice and thin, this highlight, but I'm just catching the very edges of the casing to the rifle with an edge highlight of Warpstone Glow. And with that Warpstone Glow highlight applied, the next thing I'm going to highlight are the Aquila details. And for this, I'm using White Scar. And I'm just going to carefully pick out all the raised parts to the Aquilas. So I'm going to be nice and careful here and just pick out all the sharp edges, raised details like the skulls and the wings with a really thin edge highlight of White Scar. This works really well with the Celestia Grey and the Nuln Oil to give a really great looking white skull at the end. So just catch these with a thin edge highlight of White Scar. And with those Aquilas highlighted, there is just one final thing left to highlight on this model, and that's going to be the metallics. So for this, I'm using Stormhost Silver, and I'm just going to carefully apply an edge highlight to all the areas we painted with Lead Belcher. So the tip of the muzzle, all of these details, so the magazine and the pistol grip, I'm just catching these with a thin edge highlight of Stormhost Silver. It's just going to give the impression of light catching on the sharp points to the metal and really just finish off this Imperial Guardsman. And with that highlight applied, that is how to paint a prison soldier for the Imperial Guard for your games of Warhammer 40,000. So please let me know in the comments down below, are there any other regiments or legions that you would like to see me paint an Imperial Guardsman as? And thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and come and join me over on Patreon, where I have a free Patreon tier where I'm building up a great little painting community. And happy painting!